Joseon dynasty, but I'm going to try to be focusing on a little bit more I wouldn't say the lighter side, but some of the positive ways that women were able to deal with their situation. There's a lot of focus on how women were, really oppressed, and really held back and beaten down. And that's not to say that wasn't true, because when I came into this, like, yeah, we're going to be optimistic. And the more books I read, I was like, dang, this could be hard. But there's actually a lot of good ways. So we're going to talk about some optimistic viewpoints, and it's going to be accompanied by using photos of nature. So I'll take them by me. Okay, but why Joseon women? It's a really important area in the history of women's studies. There's a lot of focus on it. As you see, we've just had 2 presentations on it. We're going to have another one, not necessarily about Joseon, but just following that area right after. But as we look at this era in world history, and especially in Korean history, it was a very formative and influential time for women's roles. And as Aline just told us, there was a lot of change during that era. But as this quote says right here, the women of the Joseon dynasty didn't just take it all laying down. They weren't just passive bystanders. They were active participants in shaping their futures and shaping the way that the dynasty moved forward. And also, as the last presentation noted, there was a lot of change from the beginning of the Joseon era to the end of the Joseon era. And we can't just assume that they were all the same. A really important part of studying this area of history, and this presentation is also sort of supposed to be a jumping off point for you all to get really interested, is to move away from generalizations like Confucianism and women. Because as noted, women are all different, their situations are all different, and there were huge gaps between what happened in the upper classes and the lower classes. And also, what Confucianism is, and its definition and the practices that were involved, changed a lot over the period of the Joseon dynasty. And so, it's not always as bad as it might seem, it's not always as good, and it's really different depending on area and situation. So, one of the parts of Confucianism and the development and the role that women played was that they negotiated their own space. And part of the study is looking at how the women sort of would make their own space in society. An example a really good example, there's a person named Lady Chung who lived during the, I think, late 16th century through into the 17th century of Korea. And she's a really unique person. She was an upper-class member of society, well-educated from a very strong Confucian family. And she's interesting from the point of view that she very heavily embraced Confucian ideals and worked to incorporate them into her life. She was very focused on the idea of becoming a Confucian sage through living perfect Confucian morals. And through doing that, she was able to connect with the mainstream society. It actually gave her a stronger ability to work with men on equal terms, more or less, and but really to prove her space and to take what was given her and use those tools to bring her forward onto the scene. And it's something that is very common throughout a lot of upper class and in many cases lower class women, was to use Confucian ideas as Confucianism grew stronger and became more set in its ways during the Joseon period, to adapt and to find, in some cases, loopholes, but to find areas where they can succeed. A lot of women, as you know, had a lot of influence and power in domestic areas. They had a lot of power in the home. A lot of influence, were very much in charge of the economics of the home, and in many ways the raising of children. And that was not something that we can kind of just ignore. It was a really important part of society. And we'll kind of come back to that in a second. Connected with that are exemplary wives. This quote mentions from Lee Seung-gu that subordinate relations within the order of the family didn't exist necessarily, but there was a very distinct separation of roles within the family. And within that separation of roles, wives had a lot of influence and had a lot of power over the way that the house was run, the way that while they didn't necessarily perform the rites, they had a lot of influence on how the rites were carried out, preparing for the rites. And it was a really important part, especially in late Joseon dynasty, as women would marry and move into their husbands' families' homes and become part of that family. They were expected to be able to take control of these types of things as they became older. An interesting shift from the early to late Joseon period is the idea of householders is that, as noted in inheritance, women were householders in the beginning of the Joseon period. And then towards the end, if their husband died, the eldest son would be listed on the records as the householder no matter how old they were. So they could be like 70 and know everything, and their son could be, randomly, 12 years old, and he'd be listed there, but they wouldn't necessarily, they'd be householder pretty much in name only though. Women still had the influence, still had the power, still had the control in the household domain. And it was a very important part of society as a whole that women were able to uphold this. And they were able to use that influence quite a bit in the education of children, in the way rights were carried out, in how homes were developed. This is to make sure you're all still awake. Moving on.
No, I wasn't.
Yeah, you weren't awake. So, there were also during this time, there are many, many texts on what a virtuous woman was supposed to be. We talked a little bit about like the Lady Kyeong and her writings and different people. There was a lot of writing done by women, and there was a lot of writing done for women, and we know more of the stuff done for women. And a lot of it was written by men to kind of tell women what they should or shouldn't be doing in society, and there were a couple written by women, usually that have a much, much more of a tone that's like, this is what we're supposed to do, and this is how we can make it work for us. And so there's a lot of stuff out there that shows that women didn't just accept it, and that education and reading these texts really empowered them to speak out, to be able to function in society, and to sort of embrace what was the norm at the time. There's that saying out there that ignorance is bliss, but really we also talk about knowledge being power, and I think in this case it was much, much more like the case of the latter. Yes. And so what all this ended up creating was sort of a tension within Confucianism, and that women were able to, that there were both resources for women to kind of latch onto their ideals and make a space for themselves, at the same time that there were forces to kind of hold them back. And it shows that Confucianism wasn't really just this closed system that we think of, but it was a living, breathing organism that, as it became more set into society, still would change with society. There, within official realms, there were things that were overlooked. In the lower classes especially, a lot of Confucianism wasn't adhered to as strictly. In late Joseon dynasty, women weren't expected to remarry, or most of the time forbidden to remarry, but women of lower classes usually could get away with it, especially for economic reasons. They didn't necessarily have the ability to provide for themselves, and so remarriage was a viable option to make sure that you didn't starve to death, and your children, which was important. Another interesting example, it's if any of you are familiar with the story of Chunhyang, that it's a good example of this tension, even though it's fiction. It shows a good example. A really brief summary is that Chunhyang was born of a woman in the lowest class of society, a giseng, or sort of a courtier, I think courtesan, I think that's what it is. But, and was thus expected to sort of follow in her mother's footsteps. But the son of the local governor falls in love with her, they end up getting married, and then he has to move away to Seoul to complete his examinations to work in the government. And she's left behind. Meanwhile, the new governor moves in, he's a super bad guy, and he's like, I like women, she's the prettiest lady. And they're like, Chunhyang is fine. And so he says, okay, bring her to me. And she refuses to do anything for him. And so what we see here is a tension within Confucianism that he is above her in every way in society. And he's a male, he's the governor, just everything. And she says no, even when she should have to obey him. And then she quotes the Confucian idea of morals that I can't have two husbands. I can't serve two kings, I can't serve two husbands. And so we have a conflicting of ideas within Confucianism itself that she is utilizing to give herself space, and ultimately, through a lot of hardship that follows that, the story ends well. So, hopefully this was an opportunity for you to kind of think about the situation in the Joseon dynasty more broadly. We didn't have a lot of time in 10 minutes to get into like the nitty-gritty specifics of each example, but I hope that as you continue your studies in Joseon and as you think about it, remember that as in all parts of history, we can't just follow the generalizations, and we can't accept a lot of terms at face value. There's a lot of differences in people, there's situations, times, and especially in this part of history, there's a lot of rich culture that comes out of women's roles in society. Literature, art, and the way that they truly shaped the future of Korea by creating a space for themselves. And that's it. Questions, if there are any?